So the next thing we'll talk about is diet. So Candoya in general, they do tend to be a little bit of a specialized feeder. In the wild, these guys will eat Howdy doodly neighborinos, it's Collin, and in today's video we are going to be talking about one of my favorite snakes. So this is Candoya carinata, also known as the Indonesian tree boa or Indonesian ground boa. So, natural history for these guys. So these guys are members of the genus Candoya. So that is a group of snakes that is native to the southern Indo-Pacific. This particular species, Candoya carinata, is native to parts of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. So these guys are kind of found in archipelago island-like clusters. So they are a moderately sized snake, although they are very thinly bodied and morphologically really cool structure on the face and the head. These guys, of course, are in the boid or Boidae family, so that means they are a boa. So these guys, along with all the other members of their genus, they give all live birth, which is pretty interesting for an arboreal snake. So now we'll talk about lifespan. In general for these guys, this species in captivity, on average, although they're capable of living over 20 years, on average these guys live around 10 to 15 years. Now, while there have been a lot of really good efforts as far as captive breeding and production in the last several years, there is still about a good 50-50 mix of wild-caught versus captive-bred animals. In general, of course, a wild-caught animal could have other underlying issues that could shorten its lifespan, but for captive-bred animals, it's not unrealistic to believe that with proper care, these guys can live a solid 15 years. As far as habitat goes, we know that these guys, of course, are an arboreal or semi-arboreal species, meaning they spend the majority of their time up off the ground, not necessarily like super high up in trees or whatever, but they're spending the majority of their time up in bushes, in the foliage, in the plant and vegetation that grows in their native habitat. So these guys spend most of their time up off the ground. So we want to provide a habitat that's generally taller than it is necessarily wider. So popular sizes for a very small individual or a baby, you could definitely start them in like a 12 by 12 by 18 inch Exoterra or like a Zoomed front opening tank. Consequently, you could also try starting one in like a 10-gallon, but I really like the convenience of the front opening tanks. I think they're a lot nicer, and then it kind of eliminates this whole predatory aspect of coming from above to grab them, since these guys tend to be a little bit shyer. As far as an adult enclosure, great option would be like an 18 by 18 by 36 terrarium or like a 36-18, 36 paludarium if you want to have a group of them. In general, as far as housing goes, these can be housed in groups. However, I generally like to keep males separate. Although some people, depending on who you talk to, some people have had good success when you keep multiple males together as far as sparring and breeding, but breeding of this species can be a little bit more advanced, so we won't talk about that necessarily in this video. But as far as habitat size, those would be my two recommendations, either starting off at the 12-12-18 or the 18-18-24, and then working your way up to that 18-18-36 habitat would be ideal for these guys. Okay, so as far as substrate is concerned for our Indonesian tree boa, there's several options. These guys do absolutely fabulous in what we call a bioactive tank, so having lots of springtails, isopods in there as a cleanup crew. So for that reason, I would recommend with these guys going with a more tropically conducive substrate, such as our TDI tropical mix, or using a blend of Repti soil with Repti bark made by Zoomed. But I think our tropical mix is nice because it already has some charcoal and sphagnum moss mixed into it already. We want something that's going to be able to decently hold humidity as far as our substrate, as well as be conducive to the growth of live plants. So I would recommend sticking with a more tropical substrate, like our tropical mix as far as substrate goes. So the next thing we'll talk about is heating and lighting. So like all Candoya, these are kept a little bit cooler than some of your arboreal species. So basking temperature for these guys realistically is somewhere about 80 degrees, 80 to 82 degrees. So that's considerably cooler than most of your other tree snakes. Ambient temperatures in the low to mid 70s on the cool side of the enclosure is perfectly fine. And then nighttime temperatures dropping as low as 68 is totally acceptable. We can achieve this through several means. Me personally, I like to use a flood bulb, some sort of incandescent basking flood bulb. That's gonna be really great as far as heating up the air, especially since these guys are a canopy dweller. We want more of a diffused ambient basking spot than necessarily like a very tight beam on these guys. The wattage will be relative to the enclosure size you're using, so if you have any questions about specific wattage for your tank, be sure to ask an associate. But of course, incandescent basking flood would be an excellent choice for your heat source. Now, as far as UVB, these guys are nocturnal, so it's not necessarily required, but with all my reptiles, I do highly recommend adding it on there. And for these guys, a low strength CFL bulb, or using like a ZoomEd 5.0 T5 high output would be an excellent choice for your enclosure. Number one, it helps to contribute to a more naturalistic environment for them and having that good photo period. But then the second thing as well is that UVB in itself is actually sort of antimicrobial. So having a high humidity environment with lots of stuff going on in it, it's always nice to have that UVB. It helps to keep microbe levels down in the terrarium. So 5.0 or lower in the strength for your UVB, you could even use like a 2.5% or what they call a 2.0. That would work excellent as well. As far as humidity is concerned for these guys, humidity is best kept between a range of 60 to 80%. So while these guys don't necessarily need constant high humidity, it is advisable to spray them down probably at least once a day. A good way to track this would be using a high quality hygrometer or something like an environmental control center to monitor the humidity in your enclosure. We do like high humidity with these guys, so 60 to 80%. However, these guys, obviously being from tropical regions or like subtropical regions, they do also appreciate good ventilation. So even though we have high humidity, we don't necessarily want our enclosure to be completely stagnant. It is good to have some airflow in the enclosure. So keep that in mind. If you give a really good saturation with like a mister or a fogger or your hand spraying, be sure to let it dry out a little bit in between. That's going to be beneficial for the animal's respiratory system. Give it a little bit of a break as far as fresh oxygen in the tank, not so stagnant. So the next thing we'll talk about is diet. So Candoya in general, they do tend to be a little bit of a specialized feeder. In the wild, these guys will eat a variety of different things. Their diet largely subsists of small amphibians and lizards. In captivity, they can be transitioned to a diet of frozen thawed or live small rodents. However, in general, most of the time with these guys, they are going to be eating like feeder lizards like house geckos or feeder anoles. One consideration with this is too, especially if they're like a newly established wild-caught animal, a lot of times they will refuse to eat anything but live, so that can be a little tricky as well. Some people have had success conditioning them onto different foods like frog links and other products like that, but in my experience, it tends to be a little bit mixed. These guys being mainly a reptile eater in the wild, their digestive system is kind of specialized towards that. So although some people have transitioned them into rodents in captivity, it can be a little bit tricky as far as them getting used to that diet, since the overall nutritional composition of those two different organisms is very different. One thing about these guys, care overall is pretty easy, but they are a specialized feeder. So as far as your daily maintenance for these guys, me personally, I always like to do a great visual inspection of the tank, make sure everything looks good. Any excessive feces, urates, if they go to the bathroom on the glass or anything like that, be sure to clean that up. Make sure they have a fresh water source available in the tank at all times. Although these guys are sometimes not super conducive to drinking out of a bowl, I do like to provide it. Another nice thing you could also do is you could also put in like a little waterfall or a dripper plant in the enclosure for these guys. Sometimes the movement of the water will entice them to drink a little bit more. These guys in general too, they will drink somewhat from droplets on the leaves and on the plants from spraying the enclosure. So making sure our water's good, changing out, or any bedding is necessary or spot cleaning is related to feces, and then like just making sure your ambient humidity and temperatures are good. I go through once a week in all my enclosures, make sure my temperatures are good, and then with these guys, you're gonna spray as necessary based upon what your hygrometer tells you. Especially for new folks, a lot of times they're really bad about eyeing it as far as ambient humidity, so it's best to go off of what your data says based on your sensors. So definitely keep an eye on that. One thing too, in drier climates, it can be really useful is using something like our Humidity Plus terrarium cover by ZoomEd. That can help retain a lot of that humidity in the top of your enclosure. It's a nice silicone cover. One thing that's really unique about that as well is that that particular cover also allows a spectrum of UVB to penetrate. So that's something nice you can add onto the tank that'll help with retaining that humidity, maybe reducing your maintenance too. But in general, it could be a good idea to have like a monsoon or a fogger. Only thing with your fogger is you do want to have that on a limited time for the day or run it intermittently. I don't like to run it 24/7. We talked about that air circulation with stagnant air. You run the fogger 24/7, it's going to make it really humid with not a lot of fresh air circulation. As far as handling and temperament, as you can see, naturally these guys are extremely docile. They're very laid back. They can be a little bit shy and reserved, but in general, these guys fairly laid back. As you can see here, he's just perched around me just like in my hand is a treat. So in general, although they can be a little bit shyer when they're babies, these guys, very easy to handle overall, and they do have that very small specialized mouth, so they're not really prone to biting or anything like that. It does depend on the species, but with the Carinata, tends to be pretty laid back and very gentle snake. If you have any questions about Indonesian tree boas or want to learn more, be sure to drop us a message online or see us in store. Have a great day.